Welcome. We are speaking with Dr. Alan Robinson, who is the head of the Department of Mechanical Engineering at Carnegie Mellon University. Welcome.
Oh, great to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Dr. Robinson. Our first question is about climate change. How exactly does it influence air quality?
Well, it influences air quality in lots of different ways. And so, first of all, it's important to think about climate change that it's not just temperature, right? Often people talk about global warming and things like that, but climate change is really changing the climate. So it's lots of different sort of variables: temperature, precipitation, boundary layer circulation, and things like that. And all those things impact air quality. And there's lots of different sort of interactions between those terms. And so, on balance, we think air quality is going to degrade, associated with climate change. And so an example is ozone air pollution, and increased temperatures changes the atmospheric chemistry some that leads to sort of increased ozone production and higher ozone exposures. It's not doubling or anything like that. I mean, it's going up by 5% or 6%. But if you live in an area with unhealthy air, I mean, every little bit is an issue. And if you're a regulator trying to get that place under the limit, that extra challenge can be hard. But it's heterogeneous. I mean, if we look about climate change, we think about it in terms of global temperature and things like that. But precipitation patterns are very, very widely spatially, and changes in that will have a big effect on air quality. If it starts to rain more, it's going to rain globally, it's going to rain more. But in particular areas, certainly the western North America, we're supposed to get less rain. And so that will, precipitation rain is a big removal mechanism. And so if that decreases, that could also lead to increase in air pollution concentrations. Whereas other parts of the country, there may be more rain, and so that'll actually reduce the air pollution. So it's pretty heterogeneous. On balance, I would say people think that the air quality get a bit worse, not dramatically worse, but a bit worse because of climate change.
Right, okay.
And so that's the direct effects. I guess I was just about sort of changes in meteorology. I mean, the other thing that climate change affects is emissions. And so if we think about, here we are in BC, and you just rolled out of the summer of 2017, which was a tough summer for wildfires, and that can have a dramatic impact on air quality, as everybody knows. It's like sitting downwind of a campfire. And, if you look at the projections, you look at the historical data, and the amount of wildfire activity has increased. And some of that is correlated with increases in temperature and other sort of climate change related variables. And certainly looking forward into the future, the projections are not great. That the wildfires are going to increase even more, and that's going to have a really big impact on air quality. So that would be an example of, it's a little more indirect, right? So we have more wildfires due to a lot of reasons, but one is because of climate change. And then there are other natural systems that emit air pollutants or species that participate in atmospheric chemistry that leads to air pollution. So trees are a big source of what are called volatile organic compounds, which are these organic gases which interact with other pollution, say from cars, to help form ozone and things like that. And so those emissions are very sensitive to temperature. So as the climate warms up a little bit, trees will emit more VOCs, and they'll contribute to pollution. So that's another effect. And so you've got the kind of just the basic meteorology effect, and then you've got this kind of indirect effect of emissions. And the combination of both of those things are that we expect air pollution levels to increase a little bit. And then the final point I want to make on that is we have to put it in context, because certainly in North America and Canada and the United States, anthropogenic emissions, our cars are cleaner than they used to be, our factories are cleaner, our power plants are cleaner, and so our emissions are going down. And so when we think about the influence of climate change and that causing it to go up, it's in this context of sort of anthropogenic human activity emissions going down. And so if you put all those pieces together, on balance, air quality will be cleaner in the future, and that's because of cleaner cars. If we get electrification, cleaner power plants, more use of natural gas, more renewable energy, all those changes lead to cleaner air. But we're not going to get quite as much benefit as we would have before because of these sort of upward pressures associated with climate change. Does that make sense? So it's sort of this complicated system. There's not sort of one straight answer. If we could run the thought experiment and say, well, we just have climate change, no change in emissions, air quality would probably be a bit worse in most places. Changes in natural emissions would cause it to go up even a bit more, but then the big changes in human activities and human emissions will actually, those are very big, and they'll cause it to be less. So air quality is going to improve in the future, I would say, but not as much as it would have without climate change. How about that for a good academic answer?
I understood it. So that's good. Thank you. And of course, it's a global problem. Can you comment on the role that cities and states, or in Canada, provinces, can play in addressing climate change?
Well, I think they have a really important role, because if you think about it, I mean, it's easy to get overwhelmed. I mean, even cities it's a collection of people, so it's a community, and ultimately our emissions are related to human activities, right? Whether or not it's like driving to work in the morning or buying something from the store that has to get produced somewhere and things like that. And, and ultimately we have to change those activities on some level to reduce our emissions and things like that. And so cities obviously are this collection of people, who can make decisions and move forward. And there's lots of sort of concrete ways that cities can do it. And Vancouver, I think, has done a bunch of those things. When I look here, I ride my bike to work, and I look at all the bike infrastructure that you have here and things like that. And when I was in Vancouver 20 years ago, a lot of that didn't exist, not to the extent it does now. Your light rail system and things like that, and its usage. These are sort of steps in the right direction. And the cities, I think, can play a very important role in helping define that. So, and then the province, I mean, obviously this is sort of a larger sort of collection of resources, and it gets more heterogeneous. They're very different communities within, say, British Columbia. So, but again, if we think about it, from an individual or an individual city perspective, it's easy to say, oh, it doesn't matter, whatever Vancouver doesn't matter. It's a global problem. There are 7 billion people in the world. But if everybody takes that attitude, we're never going to get there. And so cities like Vancouver, or cities in the United States that are sort of fortunate enough to have resources, we need to lead and start that process and demonstrate that you can have successful, livable cities that, and being addressing climate change sort of at the same time. And so I think places like Vancouver, I think, are really uniquely positioned to be those leaders that to sort of set the stage for other places. So I think they have a very important role, I think, to play.
Great, thanks. Are there examples where actions to address climate change actually make air quality worse?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. So a lot of, air quality and climate, a lot of the sources are the same, right? They're all tied up in energy, whether or not it's generating electricity or it's driving around in your car or things like that. And so there's a lot of sort of shared sources. So when you start making changes to those sources, you run the risk, as you said, of sort of degrading air quality. And there are certainly examples of that's happened today. And so one example that I gave in my talk today was looking at gasoline direct injection engines. And so this is a type of engine that's in many cars. And historically, we had something called port fuel injection engine. And so essentially the way the gas is introduced into the engine is different. And it changes the combustion inside the engine cylinder, and it has different pollutant formation characteristics. And so we've switched from these port fuel injection engines into gasoline direct injection engines. And this has really happened over the last decade. And we've done this because the fuel economy is a bit higher, about 5% higher for gasoline direct injection engines. So say in the United States, there's something called the CAFE standards, which trying to raise the corporate average fleet efficiency, right? So GM has to sell, on average, more efficient cars. And so one of their strategies has been to adopt, say, gasoline direct injection engines. And it's not just GM, it's all the manufacturers are doing this because they're somewhat more efficient. But because the way the fuel is injected, the amount of particulate matter formed is higher in the gasoline direct injection engines. And so, so that has a health impact. So if you live near a road, you're getting exposed to somewhat higher pollutant concentrations because of this shift that's occurred. And it's been really dramatic. So 10 years ago, 0% of the vehicles sold were gasoline direct injection. Now, at least in the United States, 50% of new vehicles sold have this technology. And in 2025, the predictions it's going to be 100% of vehicles sold, gasoline vehicles sold. So it's this huge penetration of this new technology to improve fuel economy, which is related to climate change, right? We want to burn less fuel. But there's a public health cost. And so we've looked at this in Los Angeles, say, and there right now the fleet's about 15% GDI, or gasoline direct injection vehicles, from zero, so it went up, and the emissions are about 3 times higher for particulate matter. And the public health cost associated with that is tens of millions of dollars a year if you sort of use estimates of what the additional incremental health risk is associated with PM. And the climate benefits from that 5%, if you use something like the social cost of carbon, are only a few $1 million a year. So here's a case where the climate benefits, on an economic basis are much less than the sort of public health cost associated with this new technology. So that's just one example of the challenges that exist. I mean, another example is in Europe, or in the same sector in transportation. I mean, Europe has made a decision to do a lot of diesels, right? They get you around, but diesels are much higher emitting, and the air quality in Europe for NO2 and for PM is much higher than the US, and some of that is related back to their decisions to go and do a lot more diesel, and that was partly from a fuel efficiency standpoint. So those are two examples in the transport sector where you don't get the sort of co-benefits, right? That's sort of the goal, is to get these co-benefits where the both climate and air quality are lined up. So if you're doing something for air quality, you get some climate benefit. If you do something for climate, you get some air quality benefit. Lots of things are that way, but certainly some other things are not that way. And so this is just some examples of some large-scale transformations that are happening right now in our vehicle fleets, which are, I mean, they're, in the United States, there's hundreds of millions of cars, and in 20 years, those cars are going to go from, a lower emitting technology to a higher emitting technology. The manufacturers are working on improving that technology, reducing the emissions and things like that. So it's not a static environment and things like that. But that's just one example of sort of the challenges. And there are lots of other little cute examples as well, from things like white roofs on houses and what that does for pollutant dispersion and things like that. And so white roofs reduces the cooling burden on the house, but it changes the atmospheric dynamics above the house and things like that. And so, that's another sort of cute example of technology that you might put in place for climate change that might have, deteriorate air quality a little bit. So.
Clearly a topic that one could talk about for
yeah, I mean,
hours.
there's a lot of, and as we move forward and think about, how do we address climate change and air quality, and what's sort of the most efficient pathway forward? I mean, these are people need to be thinking holistically about these sorts of problems. But the other thing is important. I mean, I think there are a couple of other things. I mean, one is there's no free lunch, right? I mean, there's always sorts of challenges, and we're better off with cars and all the modern technology, and there's some challenges that go along with some of that, and sometimes I feel like people can throw up their hands and go, oh, it's hopeless, or things can be so controversial or something like that. But it's important to sort of take, I think, a broader perspective and and try to make those sort of incremental improvements and things like that.
Fascinating. Okay. We're out of time, Dr. Robinson, but thank you so much for
Great.
joining us and answering our questions.
All right, my pleasure.